Well, good morning, folks. I'm glad that you're here with us wherever you are, and those folks at our Caswell campus, so glad that you would be with us and hanging out with us. We're going to jump into Jonah chapter 2 today, so if you want to go ahead and turn in your Bibles, turn to Jonah chapter 2. Jonah's a little hard to find in the Old Testament, so feel free to use your table of contents at the front of the Bible. That's okay to do at Union Church. We're completely happy with you doing that. If you want to know, mine's on page 841. If that helps you out, it probably doesn't. But we're going to be in Jonah chapter 2. And so kicked off this Jonah series last week, and you'll know Jonah chapter 1. You'll remember the pieces of Jonah chapter 1 because that's the part that everybody knows for the most part. What we're going to start to get into in 2, 3, and 4 are the obscure parts of the book of Jonah that nobody really talks about, doesn't tell in the context of a kid's story in church. Especially if you want to read ahead, go ahead and jump into Jonah chapter 4. Nobody ever talks about Jonah chapter 4. So we're going to look at those each week. We're going to hit a whole chapter, and so today we'll read all of chapter 2. And if you want to turn there, go ahead and feel free. We are going to go back for just one quick little verse in Jonah chapter 1. But as you're doing that, let me just kind of remind you of where we are. So most people know the story of Jonah, even those folks who haven't spent time in church, because when you say the word Jonah, people always think of someone getting swallowed by a big fish. And so, in the South, we always said a big whale, but we don't know that. It's called a big fish in the word. And so Jonah, of course, doesn't obey God, and so he doesn't do what God tells him to do. God says do something very specific. He does not do it. Instead, he goes about as far opposite as he can of what God tells him to do and runs from God. In the course of that, he ends up on a boat headed way, way far away from where God said go, and then a storm comes up. He gets thrown off the boat into the water, so the people on the boat don't die, because we all know that Jonah's kind of brought this on them. And so as he's in the water, then of course Jonah chapter 1 ends with Jonah being swallowed by a great big fish. And so that's kind of where we go into chapter 2. So if you want to think about where we're at in chapter 2, we're inside the stinky stomach of a big fish. That's where we're at. And so I want to backtrack just for a minute to verses 5 and 6, the last part of verse 5 and the first part of verse 6 in chapter 1, just to kind of set the tone for what we're going to see in chapter 2. So let me go back there. Let's start off in the last part of verse 5 and then read through verse 6. It says, "But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell asleep into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, 'How can you sleep?'" Because the boat is it's going crazy. I mean, the boat's being torn apart by the storm. And so the captain's like, "How in the world can you sleep?" The captain says, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." So the captain's trying to raise Jonah's awareness and telling Jonah to call on God. So he's basically telling Jonah to pray. What we've got here is we've got Jonah being this prophet on the run, and now he's this prayerless prophet, which doesn't go real well with your line of work if you're a prophet and you're not talking to God. Because if you've got to say the stuff that God's saying as a prophet, you probably have to communicate with him. And so we've got Jonah who has basically stopped praying. And I wanted you to see that in verse 1, because as we go into verse 2, that has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about in verse 2. Jonah has stopped praying. And I couldn't help but think when I was reading this and looking over Jonah is that's kind of like a lot of people who call themselves believers, where we say we believe in God and yet we don't even speak to him. We don't even pray. And so what's funny is in our walk with God, most of the time, prayer is the first thing we stop doing. But we'll continue to come to church, and sometimes we'll continue to write checks, and sometimes we'll continue to serve and all those things. Sometimes we'll even continue to read the Word, but the first thing we stop doing is we stop talking to God, we stop praying. And that intimacy that's there, you got to have a conversation with somebody to be intimate with them, and so that conversation goes away for a lot of us that call ourselves believers and yet don't pray. And that's kind of where we're at with Jonah, who's this prophet who's supposed to be doing what God says, and yet he's not praying. Jonah chapter 2 is nothing more than the prayer of Jonah. So this is the prayer of Jonah as he's in the belly of the big fish. It is a beautiful Hebrew prayer. It is actually known as the Psalm of Jonah. And so if you've ever heard the Psalm of Jonah, it's not found in Psalms, it's found in the story of Jonah in Jonah chapter 2. And what I want you to know before we jump into this, because some of you are quite literal. So and this is one of those books of the Bible where you're going to kind of be challenged on your literalness probably. And so let's just kind of go with and understand that this is just a snapshot of his prayer, right? This is not everything that Jonah prayed. I mean, he's in the belly of this fish for 3 days and 3 nights. He probably had a whole lot of prayers that were like, help, right? I mean, he probably said that a lot. He probably said, wow, it stinks in here. I mean, there's probably lots and lots of prayers that he had as he's in the belly of this fish over 3 days. But what you got right here, what we have right here is we've got this runaway prophet who's been delivered by God, looking back and recording in hindsight the lessons that he learned during that process. So if you ever found yourself sitting at the feet of someone who's real wise, or, you know, when I say sitting at the feet of someone real wise, I think like when you used to sit at your grandparents' feet or something like that, right? Let's just say somebody who's been through some really bad stuff and they've come out on the other side, and you find yourself kind of just listening to them and paying attention to them, and what they'll end up talking about is how that whole process worked. And that's what we've got with Jonah. Like, so think of this prayer as us just kind of sitting at Jonah's feet and getting a snapshot of all the things that he learned as he was in there. That's the prayer. So it's not like a literal prayer. He didn't say in this prayer literally, I don't think. I mean, parts of it, sure. But there were other prayer parts too. But it's just a snapshot of what's going on in his prayer life and the lessons that he learned from this experience, especially up until this point, as he's literally in the belly of a fish. So that makes sense. That's where we're at to begin with. So Jonah's prayer, let's go ahead and start chapter 2, verse 1. We'll read through all of chapter 2. Luckily for you, it's only 10 verses. So now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. That's the last verse of chapter 1. Here goes chapter 2. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. When you read that verse, you have to kind of say, finally, right? Well, it's about time, isn't it? I mean, it's about time, Jonah, you started praying, because you've got a whole lot of craziness going up to this point, and then you get swallowed by a fish. It's about time you started praying. You know, in other words, God is kind of saying here, I got your attention. And it took quite a bit to get Jonah's attention. I think most of the time it takes God quite a bit to get our attention as well. Some of you, I really do feel like right now that God is getting your attention. And so over the course of the last few months, maybe the last few years, a lot of people that I've talked to recently in our church and the things they've been going through, I think God's got your attention. And the good side of that is your prayer life might be about to reemerge. And that's a really, really good thing. And so if you're in the middle of a spot where you feel like, yep, God's finally got my attention, maybe you'll be like a Jonah and your prayer life will begin to reemerge and come back. Look at the first part of verse 2. It says, he said, and now we get to the prayer, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. Now, in my distress is a real important part. And so if you're into writing in your Bible or you're into taking notes, write that down or circle it. We're going to come back to it in a minute. In my distress. We'll come back to that in a second. So this verse, I called on the Lord, and he answered me. Can you even begin to grasp? Like, I don't know if I can. Can you even begin to grasp what it means to us that we all have the ability to call on the God of the universe? I mean, how do we even put that into words? Like, you don't just have the ability to call on your mama, and mamas can do lots of stuff. You don't have just the ability to call on your daddy. Daddies can do lots of stuff. You have the ability to call on the God of the universe. And what's crazy is we can call on God, and he'll answer us. And even bigger than that, we can call on God and he'll answer us even when we've ignored him and been disobedient to him. He'll still answer us. I mean, that's just amazing to me. It's not just that we can call on him. It's not just that we can call on him and he can answer us. It's that we can call on him and he can answer us even when we have not been doing what we're supposed to do. Even when we've been disobedient and we've been, Jonah looks at him and basically says, forget you. I don't want to have nothing to do with what you're saying. I don't like what you're saying. I'm done with it. I'm running as far away from you as I possibly can. And yet he can still call on the Lord and the Lord answer him. The God of the world, the God of the universe, we can be disobedient. We can be flippant to him. We can disregard him and his instructions to us, and yet he will still answer us. Like, don't let that pass you by. Don't let that maybe that's all you needed to hear today, and you just kind of check out right now, is that you have the ability to call on the God of the universe, and he will answer you, even in your disobedience. Don't let that part pass you by today. We call on God, and he answers us even when we've ignored him. Now, if you go back to that word distress, so the Hebrew, we're going to do a bunch of Hebrew in this series. The Hebrew for the word distress is the word sarah. It's spelled like Tessera, right? You may have went to school with a girl named Tessera, but this is sarah, all right? The word sarah is kind of the best translation we have of the word distress that you see translated here. Now, he's writing in the Hebrew language, and so the Hebrew language uses tons of picture words. And so you can rarely translate a word from the Hebrew directly into a word we have as in the English that matches it. It's almost always a Hebrew picture that we then try to summarize with a word. Like when we say distress, it's not the same understanding or the same picture as the word sarah. The word sarah is used as a picture of someone giving birth. Like it's a very feminine type phrase, but it's talking about the distress of labor, the distress of childbirth. I mean, I remember when I had Olivia, when Valerie had Olivia, it was real stressful. You know, I was very stressed out while I was waiting and drinking a Dr. Pepper. I was very stressed out. But regardless, I mean, if you've ever watched childbirth, you've ever been a part of childbirth, if you've ever seen childbirth, some of you have experienced it, there's a lot of distress there. But in its own disgusting nastiness, it's quite a beautiful picture, isn't it? I mean, you know what it is, it's childbirth. But there's a serious amount of distress in childbirth. And so the phrase here is, in my distress, there's this picture of birth, of life being given. And I don't want you to miss that. Now, if you look at the next part of verse 2, there's going to be another picture word. We're going to put them together in a minute. Look at the next part of verse 2. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. So here we got another phrase, this realm of the dead phrase. In your King James Version, it'll be translated like grave or hell, same kind of thing. The picture here is this realm of the dead is this picture of Sheol, the Hebrew picture of Sheol. And so Jonah is kind of painting this picture for you with these words, like from the point that I was the furthest from God. That would be like Sheol, right? Hell, death, grave, separation from God. From the point that I was the furthest from God, from the place where I was miserable and had no way to contribute, from the place where I was helpless and desperate and afraid, I called on God and he answered me. I want you to see that. So some of you right now, before we put these two verses together, like some of you, what you're going through right now, you may feel like that you are in the middle of your own Sheol, your own hell, your own grave. There's lots of marriages that'll be in the room today and relationships that feel like they're dead and in the grave. I've been in this boat before. Maybe everything looks good on the outside, but on the inside, that depression has you feeling like dead, grave, hell, Sheol. You know this language. We don't use it well in the modern English language, but you understand the feeling that he's trying to get across. Furthest spot from God, desperate, afraid, and couldn't do anything about it. I called on God and he answered my prayer. So if you take Jonah chapter 2, verse 1, and you take verse 2 together, you're going to get this picture. So that, like, here's a phrase. I was as good as dead, but God in his mercy could cause me sarah, right? To be born again. He could cause me to rise from the dead so I could be born again. A lot of times we like to think of that whole born again thing as a Southern culture Christian thing. It's not. It's not. God has been referencing the fact that he brings us back to be born again from dead to life, all the way deep back into the Old Testament, also into the New Testament through Jesus. And what I want you to see through this is God was actively working even though Jonah was in pain. God's still working, even though Jonah is hurting. Even though Jonah is troubled and bothered and in the worst spot he's basically ever been in, God is still working through Jonah's pain. A lot of times we say, God, I want you to do this, and he doesn't. I mean, sometimes it feels like that's most of the time. God, I want you to do this thing, and then he doesn't. Don't neglect or overlook all the little things that God may be doing along the way. Because God's doing a whole lot of stuff right here in Jonah's life, and it seems like that's not the case. And there's this lot of pain that's being caused in Jonah's life, and lots and lots of pain. I mean, can you imagine being in the belly of a fish? A lot of pain being caused here, but yet God's working the whole time. Don't neglect or overlook all those things that God might be doing, that I believe he is doing along the way through your pain and through your troubles. Think of them as phases. I think that's the best way to think of this. Think of all those things that God may be doing through your pain as phases. See, God through phases, he leads us, he teaches us, he redirects us, he guides us, he heals us, he corrects us, and he convicts us until he leads us to his ultimate will. All those phases are happening through there. And it's very much an ugly, beautiful process like childbirth. Very much like that. And he's leading you through all those pieces. And so you got to kind of think of them as phases, because most of the time we want to push the fast forward button as fast as we can to get past all those phases. But if you miss them, you miss out on all the things that God's doing. Like, don't forget to embrace the phase. And I am preaching to myself right now because I am horrible at this. I'm awful at this. I want to get past the hurting phase, the growing phase. I want to get past all those things as fast as I can. And you've got to remember to embrace those phases. I think the older we get, the more we see that, and so we end up saying that backwards to our kids, right? If you notice that we'll look at kids that are can't wait to turn. You remember this? Can't wait to turn 13, and you'll be like, slow down, baby. And then can't wait to turn 16, you'll be like, it ain't all it's cracked up to be. Slow down. And then it can't wait to turn 18, and you're like, oh, that one's going to get you because you're going to have to pay taxes, and you got to do all kinds of stuff. And then I can't wait to turn 21, and I can't wait to turn 25, and you're like, look, enjoy the phase that you're at. I remember kids saying quite frequently when I was a youth pastor they couldn't wait to get out of high school, and I was like, you're going to eat them words one day because you're talking about some of the best years of your life if you'll listen to what God's telling you to do and if you'll pay attention to it. I mean, you start talking about some of that time of your life where you're really starting to figure out who you are, but you don't have the burdens of responsibilities, or heavy adult responsibilities yet. And so we got to remind ourselves of that, especially if we're older, that we cannot forget to embrace the phase that we're in, because God's still doing a lot of work right here, even though Jonah is in a big, hot mess. God's still doing a lot of work. Let's look at verse 3. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept me over. See, what you see in this verse is Jonah's wisdom is increasing. Notice what he said. He said, you hurled me into the depths. His wisdom is increasing. The sailors didn't throw him in. God did. Jonah's starting to figure out that it wasn't that they did something to me. It's that God was doing this. God had a hand in it. His wisdom is starting. Your wisdom begins to increase when you can start to delineate what God is doing in your life, what God is saying in your life, and what is just happening, what is just other people, what is just you. That's when your wisdom starts to increase. And so Jonah's you're about to see Jonah start to really figure this thing out. He's about to get back up. He's about to be a prophet again and do what God's told him to do again and be who he's been called to be and created to be again, instead of a whiny, disobedient follower of God. I would challenge you, some of you, there's your word for the day. It might be time for you to actually to get back to who God's called you to be, get back to what God's called you to do, instead of being a whiny, disobedient follower of God. His wisdom's increasing. Sailors didn't throw him in. God did. And he's figuring that out. He's starting to recognize the phase, starting to recognize the hand of God in his life, even if it's not good, even if it doesn't feel good in the moment. Look at verse 4 we'll go through the first part of 6. I said, I have been banished from your sight. Yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me, and deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. You read Jonah 1, and then all the way up through the first part of Jonah 2. And what you'll see kind of going through this entire thing, that this theme is going down. Everything's going down. Jonah's going down, the boat's going down, right? His faith's going down, his prayer life's going down. You'll just see all this down, right? And then what you're about to see in a minute is you're about to see God do what God does and lift him back up. You know, some of the greatest things in your life will happen at rock bottom. And I hate it, and I wish that wasn't the case, but maybe we just need to pause for a minute and thank God for rock bottom. Thank God for the moment where we're down is coming and we're getting there and we get to the lowest point, and then God is the one, the only one, who's able to lift us back up. Our wisdom increases, our prayer increases. We start to realize that sometimes those rock bottom things are the best thing that could have ever happened to you. That's one of the biggest pieces of Jonah's story. We talked about that last week. One of the biggest pieces is that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you, you feel like the worst thing that's in your life is actually the best thing that's ever happened to you. And while you wouldn't have picked it, if you could go back in time, you wouldn't change it because of all the good that God did on the way back up. Let me show you the rest of verse 6. 6 says, to the roots of the mountains I sank down, the earth beneath barred me in forever, but you, Lord, my God, brought my life up from the pit. Everything you've read right now through Jonah 1, through the part of Jonah 2 here, is the down. And right here at the end of verse 6, it's about to turn around. It's about to go back up. And what you see in that statement of that verse, but you, Lord, but you, God, brought me up from the pit. Never forget the but God moments. You can't ever forget the but God moments. Things were falling apart. Things were going on a crash course for hell, for Sheol, for the grave. But God did this. But God stepped in. Don't ever forget those but God moments, because that's the difference from rock bottom and going down and headed back up where he wants you to be. That's the difference. It's the but God moments. It ain't but you did, right? But you did kept getting you down further into the pit. It's the but God moments that change things. It's the but God moments in the end that we are well aware of, that we pay close attention to. All this was going on, but when God stepped in and did this, game over. That's how I feel about ministry in general. I've been in ministry since I was 19 and a half years old, full-time ministry. Can you imagine your pastor being a 19 and a half, 20-year-old punk kid? But anyway, and God's done some great things. But when Union started, it was that moment in ministry when all that was great. But when God did this, when God said, no, this is your path, everything changed. You cannot forget those but God moments. Let's look at the next verse, verse 7. This is a good one for some of you. Verse 7. When my life was ebbing away, think about water, just flowing away, right? When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Some of you today, I think, as we study this, and I pray as we study this, some of you today, you're going to remember God in this moment. It's going to be that moment where you go, I got to turn back. Like, I got to go back to what God was saying. I got to go back to what God was telling me to do. I got to go back to the path and the what he's called me to do in my life. I got to go back to the holiness that he's requiring of me. I've got to go back to that, and you're going to remember God in this moment, maybe just like Jonah is, because this is the upswing here. Down to the pit, Jonah says, but God's bringing me back. And now he's starting to remember and put his focus back on God rather than himself, rather than his situation and circumstances, rather than his preference for his life instead of God's preference for his life. He's starting to kind of remember God in that moment. And then in the next few verses, he's going to shift his tone. All right, so it's going to change a little bit. Because what you've seen until now in this prayer is really personal. And as he shifts the tone in the next couple of verses, you're going to kind of see him move back into what God's called him to do with his life. Remember, he was a prophet. What are prophets supposed to do? Connect with God and say what God said. They're supposed to connect with God and do what God told them to do. And so he declared this prophetic truth, and that's what he does as a person. That's what he's called to do as a follower of God. And so he's saying basically, as you move into these next verses, he's saying, look, whatever you do, don't do what I did. Whatever you do, don't run from God. Whatever you do, don't neglect him and don't disobey him. Don't do it. That sounds like some really good wisdom sitting at the feet of someone who's been through some junk, don't it? Don't that sound like some good wisdom of sitting at the feet of somebody who's done some stuff and they look at you and they go, don't you do what I did? Some of the greatest nuggets of wisdom that I've gotten from my father have been just like that. Don't do this, Adam. Don't do what I did. My daddy used to tell me every day that I would see him after work. And so my dad worked second shift at Goodyear and he built tires. And he taped up his fingers so it wouldn't mess his fingers up. He couldn't use gloves, so he would tape his fingers up. And when he'd come home in the evenings or whatever, if I'd wait up for him late at night, he'd have to take that tape off. His hands were calloused, black, dark, dirty, right? And he would tell me every time, Adam, you find you something that you are called to do and that you love to do, and you do it. Don't do what I did and just get a job that you end up stuck in for the rest of your life. Nugget of wisdom, right? Jonah's about to kind of transition. He's starting to speak prophetic truth again. Because that's what my daddy was saying to me. It was prophetic, right? Find your calling. Do something you love. Do something God's called you to do. Jonah's about to start to head back into that. Look at verse 8. This is probably my favorite verse of this chapter. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. If you like to write in your Bible or take notes, circle that God's love for him thing right there. The word in the Hebrew language is this word chesed, right? It's pronounced with an H there, but it's got like a CH in a minute. It's like that you know what I mean? Like we don't really have a phrase for that. And so it's chesed. It means very literally the pursuing love of God. Like the love of God that chases you down. The love of God that comes after you all the time. And if we read that verse again, it says, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. Turn away from it. And that pursuing love of God that is coming after you, you're running in the opposite direction of it, is what it's talking about. In other words, those who cling to the stupid things of this world that don't matter are unable to receive the chesed or the pursuing grace of God. It's not because it's not there for you. It's because you're running away from it. I mean, you quite literally are getting on a boat and heading as far in the other direction as you can from the pursuing grace of God. And so when you cling on to these worthless idols or these stupid things of this world, you can't get that pursuing grace because you're running the other direction from it. Man, I would hold tight to understanding that love of God part here in this verse. It's pursuing love. It is running after you. It is coming after you. And so even if you're just stepping a little bit towards him, he's pursuing after you. Where you get in trouble is where you turn and run the other direction. That's when you find yourself heading down. That's what Jonah's talking about here. He's not quite yet talking about the people he's supposed to go to preach to. He's talking about himself. He's talking about, I clung to the worthless idols of this world. I clung to the things that were important to me. And and God's grace wasn't available for me. His love wasn't available for me because I ran the opposite direction. Then I like what Jonah does in the next verse, because he does not make excuses. And I think that we as Christians make gazillions of excuses every day. All kinds of why we can't do what God says, or why this won't work for us, or whatever it may be. Look at the first part of verse 9. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. Whatever I have vowed, I will make good. No more excuses. No more, this happened because of this. Well, I told you I was going to do it, God, but then I couldn't because this didn't work out, or this didn't go the way it was supposed to, or, well, I didn't really like the plan you laid out in front of me. I'd rather do something else, and so I'll just wait till you kind of change it. No more excuses, no more blaming anybody else. Now it is, I will make my vow good. What did he vow? Like, what's his vow? We don't know. Probably, since he's a prophet, God, if you tell me to say something, I'll say it. God, if you tell me to go somewhere, I'll go there. Because remember, the whole reason he's in this spot in the first place is he refused to go where he was supposed to go, and he refused to say what he was supposed to say. And so more than likely, he's going back to this vow of being a prophet of, I vowed to you that I would go. I vowed to you that I would say. And so he's making good on this promise. Maybe there is something that just by hearing this word, you're going to make good on today. Like if God has placed something on your heart, you need to make it good. And maybe like right now is the time. Think about recently in your past where you have vowed something to God. I'm going to do this from this point on. I'm going to make this a priority. I'm going to make sure that I'm reading my Bible every day. I'm going to make sure that I'm praying and talking to you every day. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to church. I'm going to make church a priority for my family. I'm going to stop doing this. I'm going to start doing this. I'm going to be holy in this area of my life. And you've promised, you've vowed God. And maybe it's the time right now, it's like this is your Jonah 9 moment, and you're going to need to make good on the promise that you've made to God. If he's called you to do something, you probably ought to make it good. I mean, we got some big catfish around here. I don't think you got to worry about getting bit by one, but you probably ought to make it good if you vowed something to him. Those are always things that are on the upswing. Like if you'll notice, the decrease for Jonah, it's all disobedience and running and ignoring and falling off of a promise or a vow that you've made. But the upswing is always rooted in coming back to him, remembering God, and saying, no, I will do what I promised you I would do. I mean, remember where Jonah is right now as he's praying this. He's in the belly of a fish. So there is nothing at all that he could do for anything. He has zero control over where his life's going to go or what can happen to him at this point. He can't do anything right now. He's in the belly of this fish. Now watch the rest of verse 9. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. Jonah says, I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to do what you said do. And you've told me to say, salvation comes from the Lord. And so I'm going to say it. In other words, I'm going to point to you. I'm going to point that salvation doesn't come from anything else. You can't save yourself. You can run and try, but you can't save yourself. You can get yourself on the boat. You might be able to get yourself off the boat, but you definitely aren't getting yourself out of this fish mess. See, that's where salvation comes from. It's from God. It's not from you. It has nothing to do with the good things that you do. And it has nothing to do with the bad things that you do or the bad things that you don't do. How often do we kind of relegate our faith walk with God into the good things that we do and the bad things that we refrain from doing? I mean, how often do we do that? I'm guilty of this too. We kind of turn our relationship with God into, well, these are the good things that I do, and God blesses those things, and then I stay away from these bad things, and then there I'm in God's good graces, and things are good, and that's how I'm supposed to be as a Christ follower. Salvation comes from God alone. Jonah's in the belly of a fish when he proclaims this. There's absolutely nothing he can do at all for himself, for anything, and he's saying salvation comes from God. It's from God. It's not from you. This goes hand in hand. with what we understand about a relationship with Jesus Christ and salvation from Christ. It has nothing to do with what you do. It has everything to do with how good God is. That he would come down into a pit, whether it's Jonah in the pit of his stomach or whether it's you in the pit of hell that you've been sitting in, and that he would save you, offer you salvation. It has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the goodness of God. See, when you recognize that, like when you really recognize that salvation only comes from God, there's only one reasonable response, and that is to say to him, here's my life, you take it. You take it all. And so I'm going to back out of all that disobedience I was doing before where I was giving you half my life, and I'm going to come back and go, no, when I realize that there's absolutely nothing I can do, that I have no bargaining chips to go to the face of holy, perfect God with, I have nothing to negotiate, no good standing at all, and you're going to offer me salvation, my only reasonable response is, here is my life, take it. Just take it. And then what we do is we spend the rest of our life trying to figure out how he can take every little piece that we're not giving to him at the moment. Every little piece. So if you're walking around right now and you're pushing back on him taking a piece of your life, like the one that most people push back on is their money. Like we'll serve him with our hands all day and with our mouths and with our children and our families, but when it comes to serving with our money, we'll pull back. The only reasonable response when you realize that God has saved you is to go, here, you tell me what to do with everything you've given me. You tell me what to do with it. What am I supposed to do with the resources you give me? What am I supposed to do with the children you bless me with? What am I supposed to do with the relationships that you have me in? Every bit of it is yours when you realize where salvation really comes from. Now look at the last verse. We'll wrap this thing up. Verse 10. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah out onto dry land. You see the up part? Down deep in the ocean. Down deep in the water. And yet there's this upswing. And now all of a sudden, Jonah is puked out onto land. It's funny how God will change your perspective. If you didn't know the rest of the story, you'd think that was a bad day. I mean, getting puked on is a bad day any day. Getting puked out of something sounds really, really bad until you realize that he's been in the fish and he should be dead. And yet, in God's wisdom, in God's love, in God's pursuing grace, his chesed, he's caused him to Sarah, to be born again, to be brought back to life, and it's that upswing, it's that beautiful upswing. So sometimes your upswing looks like fish vomit. Sometimes it smells like fish vomit. You can get around somebody and they'll be like, ooh, you stink. Oh, yeah, but that smell is sweet, man, because you don't know where I've been before this. You don't know where I've been. You see, when you look at verse 10 and you see him spit up on the dry land, what you see here is whether you're on top of the world or whether you're in the depths of hell, when you call on the Lord, he will answer you, no matter where you are. See, I think today, we end with an altar kind of day. I think every piece of this message should do nothing more than want to bring you to the altar of God so you can just talk to him, thank him, commit again, remember the but God moments, whatever it may be. And so when we close in a moment, I want you to kind of just focus on the fact that whether you're on top of the world and everything's going right or whether you're in the depths of hell, you can call on the Lord of the universe and he will answer you. And that is worth getting on your face before God and on your knees before God and thanking him for his grace, because we do not deserve it whatsoever. We deserve, just like Jonah, to have been fish food. And yet, but God brings us back up and sets us back in a position to do what he has created us to do. What you will see next week in week 3 is you will see Jonah do what he was created to do. And I honestly think that everything he did before this, it was great and all for God or whatever, this moment is what he's created to do. Sometimes you're never going to find that moment unless you get down on your face and you pray. And you talk to Him. And you thank Him. And you go back to those moments that He's brought you through. And you recommit. Like maybe today, the big thing is that you going back to what you vowed to God that you would do. Maybe it's just not so much as do, but it's so much as who you would be. You go back to who you vowed to God that you would be. And you remember, if you're a Christ follower today, you remember that when you got saved and when God changed your life and you started to make these promises to Him that were good faith promises for sure. You vowed to be somebody different. And then there's been this gradual slip through time that you're just not that person anymore. Well, don't sulk and don't run away. When you're in the pit of hell, God will answer you if you call on Him. So maybe today we just, as we sing and we close, I'll pray, and then you just come forward to the altar wherever you are. We've got prayer team people that will pray with you if you need it. If you don't know Christ as your Savior, maybe today is the day that you get on your face before the Lord and you realize that salvation comes from the Lord, not from you. And you give your heart to Christ, whatever it may be. But maybe you just walk down to the altar as we begin to pray and sing and just get on your face before God that allows us to call on Him, even when we're disobedient and running from Him and disrespectful to Him. Jonah's disrespectful to God. And yet, He still answers him. He'll answer you too. Let's pray. Father, I ask you today that you would just move through folks, Lord, that you would just give them the strength and the power and the courage, God, to just get up out of their seats, walk down to the altar. Lord, maybe they need to pray at their seats. Just get on their knees before you and talk to you. Lord, today some of those prayers are going to go like this. I thank you for the but God moments in my life. Some of them are going to sound like, I'm in the pit of hell right now, God, and I need you. I'm crying out in my distress. Some of them are going to be, salvation comes from the Lord, and I've been banking on it being all about me all this time. God, I pray that you will move in this church right now. That you will move in wherever this message is heard, and that, God, you will hear our prayers and answer us like your word says. It's not just here in the story of Jonah. It's all in your Holy Scriptures. Where even though we disobey, even though we run, even though we tell you no, you still hear us, you still answer us, you still are the one that's lifting us back up out of the mess, off of the rock bottom, and back to where you've called us to be and who you've created us to be. Move in this place today, Father. We ask all this in the precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen.